Today, I'm going to tell you all about my first ever D&D character because he sucked, and I hope that you don't make the same mistakes that I did 6 years ago. Quick caveat before we begin, I am fully aware that these are all terrible things to do, and I don't do them anymore. That's why I'm making this video. Now, the first ever D&D campaign I played in was a Curse of Strahd campaign, where I played a half-elf paladin named Ringmar. That's mistake number one. Ringmar is a terrible name. I couldn't stand this name after like 3 months of playing. So the first thing you should do when you create your character is say your character's name like a lot. Take a day to continue saying your character's name to make sure you actually enjoy it when you hear it said a lot of times. Ringmar was a half-elf Oath of Conquest paladin. I chose paladin because paladins are awesome. I chose Oath of Conquest because it's OP and is really good for tanking, or at least it was 6 years ago. And I chose half-elf because of that sweet charisma modifier. But this video isn't about any sort of mechanical mistakes that I made, because who cares about mechanics? There are people who do that way better than me. No, the real mistake was in who Ringmar was as a character. To start, I decided that Ringmar would have paranoid schizophrenia. He heard voices in his head. I did this because I didn't want my character to be plain and vanilla and boring like I thought all of my friends' characters were. To simulate this, I wanted my DM to create like custom mechanics for Ringmar to highlight his insanity and his descent into it. I think Call of Cthulhu does this really well, but at the time, I didn't know Call of Cthulhu existed. I only knew 5e existed. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem with enough notice, but I told my DM this 6 hours before our first session. Making your DM homebrew custom mechanics that only your character would use 6 hours before the first session is what we call a dick move, and you shouldn't do it. This would also have additional repercussions of me being a shitty player later on, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Now, I thought of myself as a bit of a literary and storytelling genius. After all, I did minor in English literature in college. I know. So naturally, I had to flex my storytelling muscles by writing up like a 5-page essay on Ringmar's backstory. In this massive volume, I told the story of how Ringmar was actually the second son of the king of the half-elves of the half-elven kingdom in the north. This was set in Forgotten Realms, and I did absolutely no research whatsoever, and I created my own kingdom of half-elves in the north. This is far from the greatest sin I committed. The text that I wrote described Ringmar's problems with his brother and his father, and how he wanted to pursue the light, but he was so afflicted with this disease, and documented all of these great deeds that he had done prior to the first session. Now, maybe you're at home and thinking, oh, that sounds pretty cool, but there's two things. One, my DM probably didn't even read it because it was like 5 pages long in like 1,500 words. Ain't nobody got time for that. And second off, writing a detailed backstory like that, as I would come to learn, is terrible. When you write this massive backstory, you pigeonhole your character into this sort of prescriptive identity that you then have to reference as you play to make sure that everything's canon, rather than allowing yourself to discover your character through play. Instead of this Tolkien-esque epic that you might want to write yourself, just start with a couple of traits that you can play off of. For example, my personal favorite is rich douchebag noble who is in over their head. I love playing a douchebag. We'll get to that. When you give yourself bullet points of who your character is, you give yourself a frame of reference of the type of character you want to play, and then you allow yourself to discover this person as you play the game, which is way more fun. Now, speaking of discovering your character and playing your character and all that, remember how I said that Ringmar was crazy? Well, this was another huge mistake that I made, because this was my first ever D&D character, and I wasn't actually that comfortable with role-playing, especially because I had met my friends at the table like 3 months prior. I just didn't want to commit to playing a full-blown crazy person to these people that I met relatively recently. So instead of committing to the bit of just playing a deranged sort of character who's hearing all of these crazy things, I played a douchebag because I love playing a douchebag, and that's my safe space. I then had this weird disconnect where my DM was trying to play up the whole like crazy fantasy that I was going for, whereas I was basically playing myself, but with the douchebaggery elevated just a notch. This ended up creating a big old nothing burger of a character, and whenever I look back on Ringmar, I just am like, what was I even doing? Ringmar doesn't really have any sort of definitive character traits about them. I don't really have anything to latch onto because I was basically playing myself. Now, there's nothing wrong with playing yourself in a role-playing game, especially if you're brand new. It can be pretty helpful to get your feet wet into it, but at least in my case, it doesn't lead to any sort of memorable character, and I don't really have any cool stories about Ringmar because he just did things that I would do, and that's kind of lame. I know I just said that it's okay to play yourself, but you get what I mean. I hope. What would have fixed this? Well, for one, probably choosing to play a character that I'd be more comfortable with rather than something that I'd have to commit a lot of acting energy into. Either I should have chosen to play a douchebag noble who's in over their head, because that's me, or maybe even commit to like a dwarf and just stick with dwarven stereotypes or something like that. An easier character to play than something as complex as a schizophrenic half-elven prince. Maybe that's a me problem. Maybe all of these were me problems and you're perfect. In which case, I look forward to you letting me know in the comments. Anyways, if you're on the other side of the table and you want to hear about some problems that I've had running games and how a book called Fellowship solved them, you should click right here. And thank you so much for watching. Blah.